Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next panel, which is the Access and Equity panel. And I'd like to introduce Tony Monreal. Tony's greatest claim to fame is that he spent 2.5 years at the California Department of Education and survived. Tony was the Deputy Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction, and he led the whole 8th grade algebra conversation under State Superintendent Jack O'Connell. He's currently a Deputy Superintendent or Assistant Superintendent for the Porterville Unified School District. That's in Central Valley, and he's very proud of being from the Central Valley near Visalia. We'll have to come down and see that soon as well. And the great thing about Tony is that he's agnostic to platform. He spent time in public schools, private schools, as well as charter schools. He's really trying to make a big impact, and please join me in welcoming him as he welcomes the panel.
My grandfather used to say, "Dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres." And it was probably some of the best advice that I ever received as a young man, because one of the things you have to understand about Latinos and Latinas is that the dominant culture doesn't have to set the glass ceiling for us, we do it for ourselves. And the hardest part is getting beyond that to realize that we can be here with fantastic individuals that are like folks that are here today. When I served at the department, I had the pleasure of working with people like Ted Mitchell and people like Ken Noonan, Yvonne Chang, Thelma Melendez, Glenn Thomas, David Long, David Lopez, who's here with the National Hispanic University here in San Jose. And what I learned through that whole process was the fact that we all have opportunities to learn from our padrinos and madrinas. Loosely translated, we all have opportunities to learn from our godparents, from people who've been put into our lives to be able to make an impact. Just like today, I truly believe you're going to walk away with something that's going to resonate, that's going to help you do the right things for kids, and especially for the underrepresented students, for children of color, for children of poverty, for children who traditionally not necessarily struggle with just an achievement gap, but with an expectation gap. So I applaud you and I commend you for being here this morning, because it means that you care. And one of the things that Jack taught me that resonated and still resonates is the fact that the 3 R's are so important, and they're probably even more important now that we have less resources. Rigor, we're only going to get to be where we need to be with the rigor of content and how to use that pedagogy in order to make sure our kids learn that with that rigor. But the other two are very important for children of color and children who are underserved. The issue of relationship and the issue of relevance are just as important. And again, I'm going to refer back to that whole madrina-padrino scenario. You as teachers, the ones who stood up earlier that we applauded, are the most important people in the lives of these children. Because if you believe in them, they will achieve much more that they believe that they can achieve themselves. And I will share that with you honestly. I would not be here if it had not been people who pushed me beyond that glass ceiling to recognize that I could learn, and I could learn beyond proficiency. It was good people like yourselves who truly believed that each and every child that's put into your classroom can succeed, and can succeed beyond just the standards to make things happen. So with that said, it's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I appreciate that, Muhammad and Manny, for the opportunity to be here with you as we walk this journey towards attempting to make a bigger difference in the area of mathematics, which continues to be that thorn in our side. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel. Wonderful people who not only talk about it, but they try and do something about it. Folks that get it and really attempt to help other folks that get it. I'll begin with Manny Barbera, a colleague of mine, a friend, a former superintendent, who in his retirement is now doing, in my opinion, even better work of trying to make sure folks understand what the issue of access and equity is all about. Manny. We're privileged to have with us a teacher, a practitioner, someone who is doing the work. Courtney Caldwell has been in the classroom. She's been a coach. She's written curriculum. She's done many different things. And the one thing that's really interesting is, folks come up to this podium, you're going to find that some of them have a spiritual context. She did some time at the Dallas Theological Seminary, so I'm very interested to see how that informed your practice. Courtney Caldwell. John Danner needs no introduction. He's a person who has taken the charge of looking at how can we disrupt current systems, offer different opportunities, target certain populations, and help them to be successful. His rocket ship model is one that is really attempting to challenge status quo and help us all to learn from the things that he is attempting to do with his system and with his children. John Danner. And last but not least, and as a practitioner, I did not do this on purpose, Matt. Dr. Matt Rosen, Senior Research Associate for EdSource, also a person who has focused on middle grade through community college, focusing on the areas of mathematics, a PhD in education from this illustrious institution, Stanford University. And again, my friends, we have some of the best persons here up front to share with us this issue of access and equity, something that will transform this state as we help other states transform their current realities as well. And we're going to begin, and we're going to defer to Dr. Rosen. We're going to give him 10 minutes because we want to make sure we're hearing from what EdSource has to share with this whole thing. And Manny has been such a great guy, again, equity kind of guy. He's going to give up some of his time for Matt.
It was right in front of me. So my name is Matt Rosen. I'm EdSource's Senior Research Associate. And I'm here to set the table for talking about access and equity, and in some ways, a status report on the last 15 years. And I want to do that by telling you a story. This is a story about 70,000 California students. This is based on an analysis EdSource did with our partners from Stanford University and the American Institutes for Research. It was analysis that was supported by the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation and building on another study that was supported by Reed Hastings. These students were 8th graders. These 70,000 students were 8th graders during the 2008-9 school year. They attended roughly 303 middle grade schools across the state of California. Roughly half of these schools served predominantly students from lower income families. Roughly the other half of those schools served predominantly students from middle income families. Now, the story I'm going to share with you today is based on our analysis of restricted longitudinal data that we got from the California Department of Education, for which we thank them greatly. And these data linked students' math test scores, their CST scores, in 7th grade and 8th grade. So there are really 3 key moments in the story I'm going to tell you. 1, as 7th graders, how did you do on the grade 7 math CST? That grade level CST for this thing that California has called grade 7 math for the last 15 years or so. So these are not students that were already in algebra, they were taking grade 7 math. Second, given how you did as a 7th grader, what were your chances of being placed in Algebra 1? And the way we know this is these 70,000 students as 8th graders either took the Algebra 1 CST, which you take when you're positioned to complete a full Algebra 1 course, or they took the General Math CST, which you take when you're in something short of a full Algebra 1 course. So pre-algebra, Algebra Readiness, the first year of a 2-year Algebra 1 course, and so forth. So given how you did as a 7th grader, what were your chances of being placed in algebra? And then given both those first 2 things, how you did as a 7th grader and whether you were placed in algebra, how did you do in 8th grade on either the Algebra 1 test or the General Math test? So this is the story. And the first part is, well, how did students do as 7th graders? To understand that, we took a look at their 7th grade CST scores. And I should note here, you see on the left column, those 5 categories we're all very familiar with from the CSTs, far below basic through advanced. We actually broke basic and proficient into 2 different levels because of the policy relevance of it. We know people often focus on, well, how do we get people from the high range of basic to proficient next year and so forth, so we didn't want to treat those as monoliths. And as you can see, there was a wide range of incoming achievement amongst these 7th graders. About a quarter had scored below or far below basic as 7th graders. At the other end of the spectrum, there were 13% that had scored advanced, and the rest were evenly distributed across basic and proficient. So the next question we had was, given how wide this range was, given how you did, given where you were sorted out in that right column, what were your chances of taking the Algebra 1 test rather than the general math test? What were your chances of being placed in Algebra 1? And here's the answer to that question. Now, let me explain the chart for a second. The x-axis going horizontally, that is exactly the same as the last chart. That's just how did you do as a 7th grader. So if you scored far below basic, we're showing you all the way to the left. If you scored advanced, we're showing you all the way to the right. What we're graphing on the y-axis is what percentage of students took the Algebra 1 test rather than the general math test. And from now on, I'm just going to say what percent were placed in algebra. Perhaps not surprisingly, better prepared students were more likely to be placed in algebra, into a full Algebra 1 course as 8th graders. But notice how frequently also some of the least prepared students were also placed into such a course. So for instance, 27% of those who had scored far below basic, a third of those who had scored below basic, right about half of those who had scored low basic, and so on up. Now this is for that full group of 303 schools. But this is where access and equity is going to become part of the conversation. Remember I told you we had two groups of schools. About half of them serve predominantly lower income students, and about half serve predominantly middle income students. What does it look like if I show you exactly the same chart, but I show you those two groups of schools separately? It looks like this. The orange diamonds are the schools serving predominantly lower income students. The brown circles, which is the lower trend line, are the schools serving predominantly middle income students. And as you can see, the difference in practice in terms of how students are being placed into Algebra 1 is really quite striking. And let me focus mainly on the bottom three levels here of students who score far below basic through low basic. At each of these three levels, students in the mostly low-income schools were roughly twice as likely to be placed in Algebra 1 as were similarly prepared students in mostly middle-income schools, 15% versus 32% of those far below basic, 21% versus 39%, 32% versus 59%. And it's also notable that even at the higher range of incoming achievement, the mostly middle-income schools are a bit more conservative. So look at students who had scored high proficient. Only about 3/4 in the mostly middle-income schools were placed into Algebra 1. So what does that mean for how you do as an 8th grader? Here's the answer. This is a little bit more complicated chart, but the x-axis is exactly what it was. Just how did you do as a 7th grader? What we're showing you here now is what percentage of students scored proficient or higher on whichever test they took. So to teach you how to read this chart, I'll focus on students who scored low basic. Remember, about half those students took Algebra 1 full course and half did not. Among those who took Algebra 1, 11% scored proficient or higher on the Algebra 1 CST. Among those who took the general math CST instead, just over a quarter scored proficient or higher on the general math CST. Now, there are a couple different stories here. One, obviously, the better prepared you were as a 7th grader, the better you did on whichever test you took as an 8th grader. And this is really not surprising. But I do want to focus again on those lowest three levels, far below basic through low basic, which, remember, from that first chart is 40%, roughly thereabouts, of these 70,000 students. These least prepared students were unlikely to score highly on either test. If they were placed in Algebra 1, they were unlikely to even reach basic, much less proficient, as you can see here. But what's actually more troubling is the low rates at which they scored proficient or higher on the general math test, because what content is that? It's mostly grade 7 math, some grade 6. So in other words, the same stuff as last year. So there's a real issue here in terms of students mastering this content that we care about in terms of middle grades math, what we think of as the middle grades. So what does this mean for access and equity? Well, let's take a closer look at that last chart I showed you. This is the same chart, but now I'm showing you an extra bit of information. What I'm showing you on those two rows down below for the low-income and middle-income schools, respectively, is how many students had scored at each level as 7th graders. The top line there is the mostly low-income schools, the bottom line, the mostly middle-income. Now, first, it's important to note that students in both groups of schools scored at all levels as 7th graders. There were students who scored advanced in both groups of schools. There were students who scored far below basic in both groups of schools. That said, students in the mostly lower income schools were more likely to have scored at the lower levels. So let's look at students who scored advanced. In the mostly lower income schools, there were about 2,900 such students. In the middle income schools, 6,500. Below basic, 8,800 in the mostly lower income schools, only 4,800 in the mostly middle income schools. This is the achievement gap in action. And the mostly lower income schools have heard the call to access that we've all heard. Schools that are serving predominantly students from lower income students have heard and are answering the call for greater access to Algebra 1. And there's no question that there are some students in those schools that in former years might not have had access to the course that are positioned to do very well. But they're making decisions about student placement and instructional support in the context of long-standing achievement gaps that set the stage for many students to struggle. This is a system challenge that raises deep questions about both our goals, which in many ways was the topic of the last panel, the context through which schools provide instruction and support, which is part of what we're going to start digging into now. And although we're talking about middle grades, I'll just make a plea for elementary and early math. In some ways, the data we're showing here isn't just entirely about the middle grades. It's also about what comes before. So with that, if you weren't able to get a copy of the brief that has these data, because there were not enough for the whole room, you can download it from edsource.org, as well as various other materials on middle grades, math, as well as our EdSource Extra site, which has regular articles on issues of timely interest. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. What I'd like to do is bring Manny up and have him address one of the questions that came up beforehand as part of his delivery, and that is reflecting on that whole issue of time and how much time is necessary within that whole 6, 7, 8 grade fundamentals type of discussion, as well as the Algebra 1 piece.
Thank you, Tony. First of all, I'm not the technology person on this panel. My main focus is the equity, access, and the assessment. In fact, my son Chris is a math teacher here in the room. Was wondering what am I doing talking at a technology conference when I can barely turn on a computer. He's my IT support in the household. The Silicon Valley Education Foundation, I guess let me just, speaking of which, so I get this right. Okay, should this just work here? Chris, you want to come help me? There we go. Thanks, Chris. Okay. Our focus at the Silicon Valley Education Foundation is we partner with public school districts to prepare students for post-secondary success, which we operationally define as completion of the A to G requirements. I would suggest to you that more important than the API, completion of grade 8 algebra successfully is a more important indicator of the performance of a school district. We've researched school districts. There are many school districts with APIs in the 900 range, with pass proficiency rates in grade 8 algebra that are below districts with much lower APIs. And because of the importance of grade 8 algebra, which you've heard earlier, how it predicts future completion of the A to G requirements, and specifically Algebra 2, I would suggest that is the more important metric. Now, I'm not here to say all students should take Algebra Ready or not, but I do think it is a really critical, important metric to prepare students for that, and I'll address the time issue in just a little bit. We think there are 4 main areas that student performance can be impacted. One is policy. Now, we have a panel that's going to be talking about that, but I'll give you an example. I've spoken to many parents about A to G requirements. Most parents think that all high school graduation requirements are the same, and they're not. The completion rate for the Hispanic population of A to G requirements in Santa Clara County is 25%. But there is a district in the county that requires, Morgan Hill, I'll mention their name, that requires Algebra 2 to graduate. Their Hispanic completion rate of A to G is 35%. And I've been in conversations with them. In fact, I'm speaking to the board next week about this whole A to G issue. But policy does make a difference. Secondly, professional development and improving instructional practices. There's been a lot of conversation of Common Core. How many of you, by the way, remember the class testing in the early 90s? See, a lot of you are too young to remember. I asked that for a class I teach at San Jose State, and an administrative program, and the students in the class remembered taking them as students. There were a couple remember as students. There's a train coming if we move back to performance assessments. That's going to require a lot of professional development. My concern is we're going to do what we often do, to teachers in particular. Here it is, a couple of hours, see you later, oh, you failed. And we need to start really gearing up because professional development is awfully critical. Finally, extended time and the amount of time that students have time on task makes a difference and can improve student performance and access. And I'm going to just address these two very quickly in terms of what we're trying to do with this at the Silicon Valley Education Foundation. Relative to time, we partner with the school districts and leverage our partnerships, by the way, with two organizations that we're proud to be with, the Hispanic Foundation of Silicon Valley and A-Learn. And we have our Stepping Up to Algebra program is a 75-hour algebra readiness program during the summer, and we've added a Saturday component during the year. The idea is to get incoming grade A students at the basic level, and we've looked at Matt's and Mary's research from EdSource, that are not being recommended for algebra. So they're kind of at that basic level. And the 75 hours comes out to just about a half of a year of instruction if you use the 50-minute sort of traditional middle school model. We incorporate a college-going component for the students as well. We take them to the university. We talk to their parents about the A to G requirements. We use an interactive curriculum. It's 4 hours a day, so the teachers have an opportunity to really engage with the students and go deeply into the subject. We don't try to teach everything. The curriculum is based specifically on an analysis of the county data that we did and what students seem to be lacking, and the curriculum was developed specifically for that. The second area that I want to draw special attention to is access, and this is the area Chuck mentioned to earlier. If you have two students of equal skill level, both can go into algebra, but one goes into pre-algebra and one goes into algebra. The one in pre-algebra can have the greatest teacher in the world. He can have Dan Meyer. Still probably not going to learn as much as the student that's in algebra. So one of the areas that we really focus on is equal access as to who gets into algebra. Santa Clara County data, 74% Asians are successful in algebra at 8th grade, 54% white, 23% Hispanic and African American. And that 23% is a 5% growth over last year. So there's a definite gap there. Part of the gap is not only the extended time in preparing the students, but who gets in. And there's enough research there. If you look at the Steve Waterman research in San Mateo, that students of color in particular are hurt in terms of not having access to that class. One of the projects that we've been working with that Chuck mentioned in the East Side School District and the feeder district, so a system of 80,000 plus students. We've been able to reach agreement on a common placement protocol across the districts and then vertically into the high schools. And we've already starting to see some changes in terms of who has access to this area. And if you've not done that within your own districts, I strongly suggest taking a look at exactly who has access to that critical core class. Finally, professional development. We try to incorporate, as part of our summer program, an opportunity for the teachers to practice their instructional learning and also have access to the technology. We've incorporated this past summer the Khan Academy technology and lessons. The teachers have an opportunity to receive some professional development on it and then incorporate it within the classroom. So that's sort of the way that we've approaching, improving, and increasing the number of students who have access to grade 8 algebra. Thank you.
Learning to share and help folks of passion, let the next person take a turn is a hard thing to do, but sometimes it's very essential. And with that, we're going to bring up Courtney, who's our practitioner, who's doing the things right in the middle of where the work needs to be done.
Thank you so much for having me today. In the fall of 2010, what year is it? That sounds right. I was new to Egan School in Los Altos. I was relatively new to California, and I was tasked with teaching a couple of sections of 7th grade math called Pre-Algebra Readiness. And these kids were kids who had been unsuccessful at math for years and years and years. Some of them were performing at a 3rd grade level, if that. It was just an unfortunate situation, and my principal said, do what you can. Try and close that achievement gap. Try and help these kids master these basic skills. And so I'm teaching my first day at Egan Junior High School, and I teach my first pre-algebra readiness class, and it's going really well, and the kids are still awake, and it's exciting for me, and I think they're excited. And this young lady comes up to me at the end of class, and she said, Mrs. Cadwell, I need you to know, I hate math. I'm going to fail your class. I'm not going to do any of your homework. I don't see why I need to be here, but it's not about you, and I need you to know that. And my first thought was, hot dog, I have a project, okay? This kid is my litmus test. I'm just going to watch her all year and try to see what I can do about her attitude, about her math skills, and just forge a relationship with this student because she represented so many kids in this class. This class was made up of, kids from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, English language learners, kids with special needs. So there was a lot going on in these classes, and there were a lot of challenges. So I went to my principal and I said, okay, I need technology. I need access to laptops or tablets or something because there's a lot I can do with these kids, but I need the technology. And so she talked to our PTA, and she started this process of trying to get me access to technological tools. In the meantime, unbeknownst to me, my superintendent and assistant superintendent are forging a relationship with the Khan Academy. At that time, it consisted of 2 members, Sal Khan and his boyhood friend and president, Shantanu Sinha. And they forged this relationship, and they decided to start piloting the Khan Academy in Los Altos schools. And they had come to the decision that they were going to pilot in 3 5th grade classrooms across our district. And my principal said, they're also going to go to Courtney's class as well. And so last year I had the opportunity, beginning December 1st, to start piloting the Khan Academy with these below grade level kids. And just having the technology in their hands, it was like something different. They hadn't done this in math before. And then they started moving through the exercise modules, and they started experiencing some success in math. They got their feedback in real time. They knew if it was right. They knew it was wrong. They could get hints if they needed it. They could watch a video if they needed some extra help. And the kids were excited, and they were motivated, and they were learning math. And they were excited to come to my class for the first time ever. And so this also freed up time for me to start doing more projects with my class and more investigations, which those low-level learners never had an opportunity to do. They never got to see math in context. And so they were very engaged. I use Khan Academy as one tool among many. In Los Altos, we blend Khan Academy with our existing curriculum, with other best practices and resources. But it's really exciting and engaging for the student. It's shaken up my practice. My class looks differently every day. The kids look forward to coming and seeing how we're going to use technology, how we're going to do investigations, how we're going to collaborate. And it's a great time for the kids, and they're learning things. We had such great results that we've expanded the pilot to all 9 schools in our district this year. And we're seeing great results in 5th through 8th grade, adding this technology and beginning that conversation of what should 21st century education look like? How do we need to rethink how we do things in the classrooms? And I ask myself those questions every day as I'm planning to meet the needs of these struggling math learners. Now, this young lady, by the end of the year, was into math. She was coaching other kids. I could rely on her if somebody needed help and I was busy tutoring another student. She'd just say, Mrs. Cadwell, I got it. I know how to do that. I can help them with that. And so she was invested in the class, and we saw several students jump 2 star bands over the course of the year, from 6th grade to the end of 7th grade. So we had great results, and we're excited to see some great results continuing this year. Thank you.
I'd like to bring John up so that he can now speak to how access and equity is part of the system that's part of Rocket Ship.
Good morning. So Rocketship is a school system that we created about 5 years ago, and it was actually created for a remarkably similar reason that what Courtney just related. When I was a teacher, I taught middle school for a year, realized that I was an elementary personality, and taught elementary for a couple years. But in both experiences, kind of found myself in the place that a lot of you have probably found yourselves, where you've got several students in your class that are really a long way behind. And you talk to the other teachers and they say, well, you need to differentiate. And differentiate seems to mean you're teaching one set of kids while you're teaching another set of kids, and you're scaffolding them and doing everything right. And that never made sense to me. And so in my own classroom, I started to write individualized learning plans. I started to figure out activities that were developmentally appropriate for my most struggling students. And over the course of the 3 years I taught, I had about 90% of those students catch up to the rest of the class, become basic, proficient, or advanced. And I thought, as a new teacher, well, why is it that a teacher has to do this? Like, why do you have to go outside the box to figure this out? Why not just build a school system that works that way? So that's what Rocketship is. We have traditional classroom time, 6 hours a day, and we have an additional 2 hours a day that we call Learning Lab, which is completely individualized for every student. So every student walks in the door of Learning Lab with an individualized learning plan, and then the focus is to connect them with tutors or online lessons that are developmentally appropriate for them. And what we found is that at a system level, now with 5 schools, 2,500 students, the same thing happens. And I want to just describe the, kind of the most at-risk students, kind of your average students, and then your advanced students, because they're all extremely important in math and in language arts. We really focused a lot of time and energy early on the most at-risk students, those same students I had in my class. And sure enough, from day one, really, we've had extremely good success with that extra time and energy we put into that group in Learning Lab. And if you kind of look at the Rocketship scores and disaggregate, you find very few students that are left in far below basic and below basic, because we figure out ways to help each child. What we didn't focus as much on is, well, what's this mean to a kid that's kind of generally around class level, and what's this mean to a student that's advanced? And that's really what we've been working on for the last 2 or 3 years. So what it really means for a student who's close to grade level is they're just getting a ton more practice in this setting, right? So if you're a second grade math teacher, you know that you're going to spend about 80 hours on 2-digit addition in your classroom, and that's wonderful and fine, but our thesis was, boy, that probably could be used differently by the teacher if the kids were getting practice somewhere else. Maybe the teacher would have more time to do problem solving, integrate some of the skills, etc., teach higher order thinking skills. But if you've got to do 80 hours of 2-digit addition to get mastery, that's what you're going to do in your classroom. So that part really helps there. And then on advanced children, as soon as you get things online, it's kind of just a wonderful day for our most advanced kids. We have 4th and 5th graders performing at 7th and 8th grade level. I know this is on algebra. We've got kids doing algebra online. And when you ask them, well, what do you like about Rocketship? They say, we like Learning Lab. And you say, why? And they say, well, it's the time of the day I'm really not very bored. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it, that we're not only are we leaving behind our most struggling kids, but in a lot of ways we're leaving behind our most advanced kids, and I don't think we can afford to do that. So thanks for having me.
Okay, we have some excellent questions, and I'd ask the panelists to keep your answers short and succinct as much as possible, like a good mathematician. One of the questions, the context of question that's very interesting, and it kind of brings a couple of these together. We all understand the issue of access, students being able to take courses that are going to lead them to success through higher education or in the world of work. But is access enough? And if it's not enough, what other supports must be utilized or put into place so that kids can be successful, especially those kids who are scoring at basic, far below basic levels in order to attain that success with access. And Matt, would you like to attempt to go with that, not to put you on the spot at all?
Well, one of the things that I wish I knew about those students that I was talking about before was what happened the next year. You know, how many repeated algebra, what did it mean for them, how they felt about themselves in terms of math and so forth. And I don't know the answer to that question, but that's ultimately sort of a different spin to me on the question you're asked of, is access enough, and access to what, and what does it mean? I think for me, I'll just go back to something that came up on the last panel. This is something that we need, that's exactly the question that people need to be asking, and using data and the information that we have to try and make sense of this. You know, when we also surveyed a lot of districts and schools, and it was very clear that there weren't necessarily clear criteria for how people were thinking this through. They weren't necessarily using all the information they had. So I think this is the topic.
Okay. Manny and Courtney, you alluded to some of those supports within your context. Can you kind of share and elaborate a little bit more on those?
Sure. Access is not enough. That's one thing we learned during the pilot last year. It was really important that the teachers took on a role of coach, and as you're using the technology, had conversations about the kids, because the technology opened up doors for more student choice as far as which direction they would head and those types of things. And what we found was some students would hit a wall and they were struggling, and so they'd go back to edition 1 and work 200 problems because it was easy and they could rack up energy points, and that's not a good use of their time. And so as teachers, we started developing practices to coach our students and help our students look at their own data, and we worked closely with the Khan Academy to develop data reports to where we could weekly or bi-weekly sit down with a student, set goals with them, have that conversation. Okay, you want to get here, what are the steps you're going to take, and have the kids articulate that and develop a plan with the teacher. And then after that time period, look back in their data and say, did you use your time wisely? How are you doing? And in the meantime, the teacher had access to their data in real time so they could see where they were struggling. And I could use targeted interventions. You know, these 3 kids are struggling on this one concept, so I'll visit with these 3 kids about it, but I don't need to take time out of the entire class to reteach everybody. And so I could use my time more wisely, but the kids did need some guidance. They did need some coaching. And what was really cool for these below grade level learners was they had never had conversations like this with their teacher before. And so it opened up our relationship, and now they'll still stop me in the hall and talk to me about things and their progress and what they're struggling with, whereas before they would just shut down and not have those kinds of conversations. They didn't want to admit failure. They didn't want to admit struggles, and now they are.
Manny, could you also, as you share your thoughts, talk about, we don't get the data back until real late in the summer, so how do we deal with placement issues with that?
Well, I think the answer to the question about access enough is yes and no. Access is enough for the students who should be in there but are not because of inequitable practices. So for those students, access is the critical component. For those who are not quite there, access is not enough, and that's where the additional support, professional development, improved instructional practices, and the extended time. So that's what our model is. And I would even add, again, as I mentioned, you have to add policy as well. As far as the CST results, coming in late, well, having been a former intermediate school principal, how many intermediate school and high school principals do we have in here that build master schedules? Okay, so you know, when you get those results in August, it's very difficult to have to change the master schedule. One of the agreements that we have among the districts as far as placement is concerned is an agreement among all the districts that when the results come in August, everyone is going to review those results. And that's going to require some articulation with the district office getting the results to the schools, and the schools knowing in advance that there may be some changes necessary. So for our schools, for example, where we have our Stepping Up to Algebra program, you know, if you have 60 students go through that program, 80% of those students may be ready to move into algebra. So the principal needs to know in advance that that might happen, because when between those results and then the CST results, it may change the master schedule. It's challenging, but not impossible.
Okay. John, there's always critiques at every level, from alternative systems to traditional public systems, mainstream systems. How can your program develop scale? And can you go into some of the most impoverished neighborhoods and take over a school, for lack of a better term, and I hope not to be offensive to anyone, and will your system work with that, in that environment?
Well, we serve 90% free reduced meals, 70% English language learners right now. There's always the question with any school of choice, you know, are you getting an equally representative sample in any neighborhood? And it's hard to tell. I mean, our answer on that is we'll see when we get large enough, you know, if our results maintain or go down, because we're actually getting a different set of kids. But what I would say is that I think it's incredibly important for everybody in the school system to really think about the way that technology changes the role of teachers in schools. Just to kind of spell that out for Rocketship, at Rocketship, you know, because we have those 2 hours of learning lab time, during that time a child's not with a teacher, learning lab staffed by hourly workers, other folks. And because of that, we don't have as many teachers as a traditional school would have. So we have about $500,000 a year that we save by doing that, which we then reinvest in higher salaries, academic deans that provide professional support to our teachers, a career track and leadership development for teachers, et cetera. So what I would say is that it's very, very hard for me to figure out how anybody scales up success with low-income children using a pure traditional school model. But the question is, if we're now in the 21st century and we have technology and we have ways to make these changes to the way a school works that do give you extra money to do more professional development, pay your teachers better, have more focus, you know, how long are we going to wait? Because I think that the challenge here is California is not going to get a lot more money in education anytime soon. And we have a huge achievement gap. So given those two things, I think there's only one logical answer, which is we have to figure out some innovative ways of reaching kids in ways we haven't reached before. And I think this is one of the opportunities to do that.
Thank you. Thank you for your candor. I've been asked to deal with two questions as we're winding down before lunch. The first one, and this is very essential for our business partners to truly understand this question, because I think you can make a lot of money if you do this well. Okay? I think I've got your interest now. What is the correlation between English language proficiency and mathematical achievement, especially getting through algebra all the way through higher math? One of the things that we've done consistently is work with business partners to help folks understand it's not just about content, it's about the language supports necessary within your product, because the scaffolding has to occur with that machine and with that student. We have a hard enough time when we have a teacher involved in that process. So your systems have to be not only correlated to where the language level of the students are, and your artificial intelligence has to be able to work with that process, but it also has to be able to do that +1, so when that student is getting to that point of proficiency, it's going to bump them up to that next level of language proficiency so that they can understand your content. And I know I hope there's some high school teachers here as well. I know you guys go crazy with us when we talk about you not only teach content, but you teach language. Because academic language is the key to be able to move beyond access to the point of success. Okay? And the second and last one, and I'll defer to the panel on this one, it's important to have these tools in place. We have some of the best curriculum I've ever seen that we can't buy. We have some of the best professional development out there right now that we can't buy. We also have some great technology. You know, Ted Mitchell shared some of that with us this morning that we can't necessarily buy. So what do we have to do as a system at the state, regional, local level, and even at the national level to make sure that we're providing the essential professional development to make sure our teachers have what they need so that our kids get what they need? And that'll be our last, maybe a quick little quick comment, and we'll end this morning's activity. Sure.
I'll say quickly, I don't accept John's premise that money is not coming from California. It has to come, and I just think we can't just accept that the resources are simply not going to come. We need the resources for the professional development, and we need the resources to put these technologies. I've met with a lot of tech people. They have great products. I asked one person, who's your biggest customer on this? And he said, charter schools. And part of it is because the funding mechanisms are different, so I'll just leave it at that. But I just don't want to accept the premise that we just simply accept the fact that there aren't any resources. We need to fight for them.
I'll second that. Resources are definitely key. In Los Altos, we have multiple sharing situations. No teacher has access to the technology all the time, and we're making it work, but it does make it tough. I'd also say that we need time for teachers, time to collaborate, time to share these best practices, time to experiment and learn from one another. And when teachers have time together, amazing things happen in the classroom.
So I wanted to talk about the question about ELL and math, because it's a very interesting one for us with a 70% ELL population. And without naming names of the different vendors we use, we had a program that our kids were on a couple years ago that was actually had extremely good results on kind of an average with all the schools they were serving, and were just really, really lousy for us, and we were kind of befuddled by that for a bit. And then we kind of sat there and watched what it was doing, and when a child would get in trouble, the hint was in written text, right? And so if you're an ELL student, you're already kind of confused and frustrated, and then somebody puts up kind of a set of text which may have academic language in it. Good luck, right? So what's nice, though, is that a lot of math people, probably a lot of people in this room, actually think about math a little bit differently than that. So there are a couple programs we use, one called Dreambox, one called ST Math, where they're much more focused on kind of conceptual digital manipulatives, visualization, and things like that. And they use very little written math, kind of words. If a kid's in trouble, they give an oral prompt or whatever, and those just work a ton better for us. So again, I think that one of the advantages here as you're starting to use more technology is you can actually work with kind of the best math instruction sometimes. One of the people at our schools who's now a principal, he was our best math teacher for several years. I was asking him yesterday, how do you feel about some of the stuff that you're seeing in Learning Lab now? And he commented specifically on ST Math. He said, ST Math teaches a number of things as well as I taught it on my best day. And the more kids that I can get using those specific things in ST Math, I'm sure the better they'll do. So, I think it really is a reason to be optimistic, especially with respect to ELL students.
Thank you.
I just underscore the importance of not only professional development, but the time within a school for collaboration, for thinking about how content builds across grades and so forth, not just because of the transition to Common Core, but also looking ahead to new assessments. If they look as they're envisioned with the inclusion of constructed response, performance events, this is a different set of expectations and incentives, and we're not going to be able to do that without that time and that support.
Great. Well, I apologize for taking a little bit of your lunchtime, but I can tell my grandfather, and he's up there watching, that I had the opportunity of being with some very caring, compassionate, intelligent, courageous people. While we may not all agree, we're willing to take it on, and we're willing to discuss this honestly and professionally. Thank you all very much, and God bless you.